Hi, I'm a Camden resident. I'm a Maine native. I got educated up and down the East Coast, but then after my children were born, a lot of women, a lot of us come back home. And I think that one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is really what the different ways we can come back home look like. And we are just blessed to have a really wonderful community of gardeners among us. So I'm just one of many. There's a quite large garden group, and most of the people in our group could tell similar stories. So David and I will start to tell some stories, and I hope those other gardeners will join in and join in this conversation. So we're going to talk about rewilding our yards. And I'm Joline Blais. I teach at the University of Maine. I teach permaculture and digital skills, and I'm the advisor for the Terrell House Permaculture Living and Learning Center, and I'm a board member with Permaculture Association of the Northeast. So that's a little bit of my background, and let's talk about rewilding yards. So these are the things that we'll be talking about tonight. What is rewilding? Why would we do it? What are some native species that we can plant? And David will give you a whole description of what he's done on his property. Then I will talk a little bit about native volunteers, and then maybe we'll end with community rewilding. How can we connect all the things we're doing together in a larger pattern, not just individually? So I do have a quiz, and the quiz that everyone can take, and extra points if you get it right. So every single image in this slide presentation is from David's gardens or mine, either currently or in the past, except for two. So if you can pick out the two that are not from our gardens, then you win the prize. So just had to mention that. Okay. So what is rewilding? We'll start with that. So I'm just going to quickly go through some of the reasons, what rewilding is, and then some of the reasons of why we might want to do it. Some of these are already familiar to you. We can come back to these, later on at the end if we want to, but this is just to give an umbrella to the reasons for why we're doing what we're doing. So we're restoring ecology, right? We're helping native flora and fauna to thrive. Rewilding also adds biodiversity for local wildlife, for birds, for pollinators, for small mammals. We're also following nature. We're allowing nature to do more of the work and not just having the gardener take over and do everything and control everything. We're also building resilience because when we work with native plants, when we rewild, we're improving soil health, we're sequestering carbon. We're also creating likely more resilient ecosystems, and we're probably managing water in the process, right? These are all things that happen as you rewild, and you'll see in some of the examples that we show you. So other benefits or other aspects of what rewilding is we also, when we're rewilding, we're connecting with nature, we're reducing bad inputs, we're limiting pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers. Well, why? Because a diverse, wilder garden confuses pests, and you don't have a monoculture where one single pest can come in and just wipe out the whole crop. You have a really confusing setup. You have lots of sort of smells and sights and sounds and structures that really confuse big populations of pests. So you often get very lower pest pressure. So you need to use less herbicides or pesticides or any of those kinds of things that you might ordinarily be using if you're just trying to maintain a lawn. One of the things we'll talk about later on is how we can do this in community, with community, and also as a community organization. Can we share our wild spaces? And can we, benefit from the environmental and the social benefits? And these are places that we can also do education with our young children and with our grandchildren and with, schools nearby, and with all of the older children like us who are still learning things. So these are all some of the reasons, these are all some of the, what we are talking about when we talk about rewilding. So these are alternating pictures in both slides from David's gardens and mine. You can see there's some interesting similarities between the two of them. And then just very briefly, why are we redoing this? And there's some overlap in these. In the background, you can tell this is from David's property. That's his greenhouse in the background and his beautiful meadow. Out front, you can probably name some of the flowers that you see there, some of the natives. This is actually an example of a project I worked on with Charles and Julia Yelton, who came to Maine
That's not your yard.
That is not my yard. I wish, right? No, not my yard. But it reminds me a great deal of David's yard. So I had to put something in there so I could feel like I wasn't overshadowed by all the wonderful things he's doing. So this is a project that Charles and Julia Yelton did in New Forest Institute in Monroe, Maine. And the project was basically designed to teach permaculture and bring inner city youth to Maine to learn some of these techniques and just be in a natural world. And they had a forest in behind, and they took the grounds in front, and the Yeltons basically did a permaculture design. You can see the pond sort of a little bit on the right-hand side, and you can see all the different layers of this. And that's one of the things I wanted to sort of mention is not only do you have lots of color, lots of texture, lots of variety, there's a lot of biodiversity, but you also have many different layers, right? So in permaculture, we talk about 7 different layers of things that you can grow. And so let me just name some of those. So in this particular garden, you probably can't see them, but there are probably ground covers somewhere. I'm sure in their design they have some. And then you would have the herbal layer, which is the sort of next higher up. And then after that, you might have the sort of small shrub layer. And I forgot there's also a root layer, right? There's things happening underground, there's a root layer. Then you also have the small trees, canopy trees, and vines. So when you're designing a garden, you don't just have to think about one layer, you can actually grow food in all of those 7 different layers. So this is a really good example of something that has at least 3 or 4, and you can see some of the trees in the background. So it's closer to forest gardening than it is to sort of annual plants, but it's an example of sort of multi-layered. And so I think closer to a kind of wild, natural setting, having these sort of various layers in place. So again, we already talked about biodiversity, but reparation is really important too, because I hear people talk about sustainability and I think, gosh, that's just not enough, because we are in a really degraded landscape by comparison to what it was 50, 70, 100 years ago. Like this is a kind of a slow boiling frog situation, but the forest that I grew up in is now a mall. And I'm sure some of you have other examples like that. Friends of mine who are in the Northwest just have heartbreaking stories of the cutting down of the old growth forest, 1,000-year-old trees, right? And so we have lost a lot of our native kind of resilience and biodiversity. And so sustaining this is not good enough. We actually have to get in the process of not just sustaining, but regenerating. And rewilding our yards puts us in that kind of relationship with the natural world. We are going to rewild, rebuild the ecosystem, rebuild the relationships, rebuild the plant communities so that, we have a thriving ecosystem. And these kind of systems produce better health, both for the environment and for the people there. So one of the famous Japanese permaculturalists, Masanobu Fukuoka, and I'm going to paraphrase him. He talks about farmers, but it could easily be gardeners, or it doesn't have to be a whole farm. But he says the real importance of farming is not to produce crops. The real importance of farming is to produce a farmer connected to the land. That what you're doing to yourself when you do this work is critical. It's really coming back into that relationship with your home, that relationship to what grounds us, that relationship to what has been sacred. It's rewilding ourselves. So when we say rewilding our gardens and our yards, we're really talking about coming back into that space where we are rewilding who we are. So that's one of the, I think, the main benefits of all of this. So that's a quick background. We can come back to any of these topics if we want near the end, but I just want to turn this over to David so he can show us his other marvelous gardening example. So David, it's all yours.
Well, good evening. It's really exciting for me to be here. And I want to start out by thanking Joline and Molly and Beatty and the other people who have asked me to be here and talk about a particular issue of rewilding, which is how you prep and plant a meadow that was at one point a yard. And it's going to be fairly focused on that particular issue of how you prep and plant and create a meadow and what it looks like and how you do it. I want to start out with some general comments, however, first. And I think the main point that I want to make whenever I talk with people is that climate action begins with us, with the individuals, with homeowners, with people in the community. It's not going to happen because of the government. It's not going to happen because of very wealthy people coming in and saving us from the degradation of the planet, degradation of the environment. We have to do that. And there's not very much a 75-year-old guy like me can do by himself, but if we were to do it together, and if we continue to build on ways to coordinate what we do, I think we can do a great deal here locally in Camden. And that's kind of my overall message. I want to start out with my story. I came to Camden in 2017. I sailed my boat up here from North Carolina and lived on it for a couple summers and said, I want to stay here. This is a great community. I grew up in a small town in what is northeastern New England in northeastern Ohio. So there was a lot here in terms of a sense of place that appealed to me. And I was very fortunate to have found a piece of land here and purchased it in 2018. And I've been since that time working pretty much full time, building a garden, building an ecosystem, doing micro farming, if you will. I grow a lot of food. I do a lot of native planting, and it really sort of evolved. I didn't come here with a plan to do this, but because of so many people who've helped me and given me advice and shown me what they can do, I've made some progress. This is a really interesting photo. It's actually in the post office. You probably passed it 1,000 times. I'm not sure you looked at it. But this is a circa 1900, and I want to point out a couple things. One is that this is where my property is up here. And I'm going to show you a blow up in a minute that will make it a little easier, but this is Chestnut Street here. For those of you who are don't see my pointer, if you look sort of right in the middle of this photograph up at the top, you see an area that looks a little bit like farmland or open land, and that's in fact what it was in 1900. And also note that throughout the town, there's a lot of open space that was farmed or that was used for growing animals, growing plants and animals that sustained the town well into the 19th century. Before there were roads and railroads that could bring in food, this town had to sustain itself. And that was something that really impressed me. Now, here in this photograph, which is a blow up of that area that I was describing, you can see that this is Lime Rock, and here's the junction with Lime Rock and Chestnut. And up here, some of these buildings are still standing, some of them are not. This building right here in the middle, it looks like a big barn. That was Parker Morse Hooper's mansion. Parker Morse Hooper is the famous architect from Fall River, Massachusetts, who designed this library, among other buildings. And he bought 5 farms here, family farms. I've looked at the deeds. Probably these were pretty important farms and for food and byproducts, animals, pastures, up until about the time that he started to acquire them, which was in the 1880s. And by 1890 or so, he had bought all of this property, which eventually became the Greenfield subdivision, which is where I live. And a lot of people don't know that place, but some people do. If you go to the top of Chestnut, almost at the very top, there's a street called Greenfield. And Greenfield goes right about here. And this arrow is right about where my house is now. Linden Lane, which is where I live, goes north and south basically, but it's not on the map here at all. So this is, you can see Beauchamp Point over here in the far distance, and get yourself oriented. And the point is that some of these buildings are still standing. The mansion's not standing, but the carriage house has been bought and then has been recently, in the last 2 years, renovated and enlarged significantly. This house is not here. This stone house over here is here. This house here is also still present. And so when I got there and I started asking people about and inquiring about the history of this property and what it was like, I started to get the idea that I could sort of channel those older farmers and perhaps restore some of the farmland that was completely degraded. The topsoil on my property has been removed at least twice. It was really very, very challenging and has been challenging to restore the soil of the property starting out. So here's my house. Now we're looking west, the front of the house. You're looking at the back of the house, but facing west is the front of the house. And that area just in front of the house is where I decided I would take lawn out and build a meadow. Now, there's basically two kinds of meadows, right? And Joline's going to talk about the other kind of meadow, which is you sort of let things grow and then manage it. And of course, that's a very beautiful way to do a meadow. I decided I wanted to do what I call a faux meadow, which is really sort of a false meadow, but it's a way of quickly and efficiently, although at some cost, converting your yard or some portion of your yard into a meadow. Now we're going to, in the next slide, we're going to turn around and we're going to be facing the other way. So now you're looking at the front of the house, from the front of the house, at the front of the house. And I've added this area in here with a rough outline to show where I plan to plant the meadow. It's about 800 square feet. And the challenge is that this is native soil, but it's got a lot of things growing in there. It's got a lot of grasses, it's got a lot of native weeds, it's got just sort of all the stuff that would be growing if you didn't do anything to the property, and you took the topsoil away 2 or 3 times over the last 10 years. So this has to be prepped. And there are several ways to do this, but the way that I chose to do it was to cover the entire area with black garden fabric. And so in the fall of 2020, on the left-hand side, you see that whole area in front of the house that was some sort of lawn, and to become a lawn would have taken a lot of effort to grow and fertilize it, is covered with that black fabric, and then I've weighted it down. And I did that, it was about 6 months that it took before, in the early summer of 2021, I removed the fabric, and what you got was initially a lot of organic material that had to be raked up, but that didn't take more than a couple hours. What took a lot of time was that I have a small electric tiller with a 5-inch tine, and it took 2 or 3 days to do the tilling of that property. It wasn't very deep. It wasn't very deep at all, 4 or 5 inches, but we got thousands of stones, right? And that was really what the work was keeping the tines free of the stones and getting this property, this 800 square feet, to the point where we could start to plant in it. All the old organic material's gone, most of it anyways. Most of the weeds have been removed, and we could start to plant. So planting day came in mid-June 2021, and I want to thank Andrew DiFiore of Campo Di Fiore in Bodenham, Maine. He helped me with the design and supplied all of the plants. There are about 150 plants that we planted. It took about a morning to do that. And because the soil had been prepared, it was fairly easy to do. We put a little fertilizer in with each plant, but by the early afternoon, we had finished it, and it looked pretty much like this on the left-hand side. Of course, it needed to be watered. And I should mention that initially there were 5 different native flowering perennial plants, and I can talk about what those were during the question and answer period, and 2 native grasses that formed a matrix for those plants. A month later, on the right, you see that those plants are thriving. They're doing really well. All I've done at that point is water them. And if we needed to, I think we had some rain then, but I'm not sure. That may have been our dry summer. And also done some mulching around each one of the plants. This is 2 years later. So to orient you now, you're just really right above it, right? And you're seeing the sort of triangular area of the meadow itself. You can see that it's all grown in. This is fairly early summer. So what predominates at that point is Baptisia, Liatris, there's butterfly milkweed, and echinacea, brown-eyed Susan, black-eyed Susan. And down here in the sort of bushy areas are the asters that are doing really well, but they won't flower until, of course, later in the summer. And part of the idea of this is to get something flowering all summer long, from basically late spring all the way through the end of October. There's some native plant, flowering plant, some forb that is flowering, attracting bees, allowing pollination to occur, and it's at this point pretty successful. Some people think, well, you just let it go from there. That's probably not true. We could talk about maintenance issues, but it's a real joy to maintain this area. I only wish I'd done more than this 800 square feet. And then this is another higher elevation view that sort of shows how I've begun to integrate that area with what I call the woodlands, which are off to the right in this picture, and the main growing area of the gardens and the raised beds, which are on the left. And I can look out my front window and see that all year round. I don't have a picture of what it looks like in the winter, but it's quite beautiful. The grasses are still there. I generally don't cut very much down in the fall. I wait until the spring so that the insects get a chance to grow in many of the hollow stem plants that are there late fall and winter. So just a couple more slides. Sort of this is an example of the things that are blossoming in early summer. Liatris, echinacea, Baptisia. I now have, I think, 4 more native perennials that have just sort of shown up from somewhere. And actually, Amy Thomas and I also have started to direct sow some additional plants like Lobelia cardinalis and what else? We did bergamot and, but
Gosh, I should have brought a list.
several more. Yeah.
4 more things, I think.
Yeah, 4 more
that
things,
area.
yeah. By midsummer, my favorite is the spotted bee balm. That's just a gorgeous flower. It attracts bees like crazy and wasps and all sorts of pollinators. And it lasts for most of the summer into the fall. And then by early fall or mid-fall, you start to get the predominance of the goldenrod and the aster. And you get that beautiful combination of the yellow and the blue and purple. It's very, very pretty. And this is what the house looks like from the front back in spring of 2023. You really can't see the meadow in this particular picture, but it gives you an idea of the other things that are going on, including the orchard over here on the right, and my greenhouse and these raised beds. I think that's my last slide. Yes, turn it back to you.
Well, I kind of wince when David says a faux meadow, because I look at the work that he's done and I think this is the gourmet version. Nobody eating gourmet food would say it's some false food. It's just wonderful and delicious and beautiful and very well crafted with lots of love and care. And so I think I really admire the work that he's done. I'm going to show you the lazy person, 20-minute Iron Chef version of how to do this work. I'm a working mother and I work far away from town and I don't have a lot of time and resources, but I really love to engage with rewilding. So I'm going to show you 3 different examples of rewilding that I've tried. I'm going to link each one to a particular permaculture principle, which I've put on each of these slides. So the first example that I'm going to show you is, this permaculture principle is observe and interact. So for those of you who've done permaculture before, one of the things that they tell you to do is don't do anything the first year you're on a property. Just watch, just listen, just look. Look at where the sun is, look at where the wind is coming. Do you have deer running through your property? Are there children playing in the backyard? Do you have bees? Do you have insects? And just keep a notebook of all the things that you're observing. And you're using that observation to sort of learn about what the energy flows are through the property, what wants to be there, what's trying to come in, what's leaving the property, is water leaving your property, what's happening and how are you going to interact with what's already there. So it's a process of listening. So for this particular example, I'm going to show you an area of my property that is around this tree, and there's some sort of planted flowers that were basic landscaping behind this, but I just left a whole little U shape to go wild, basically. I just let it go. And after looking at David's slides, and when you look at some of mine, you realize that some of the plants in my little wild, let it be garden probably come from his property. You can see like the birds and the bees have probably moved them over. So I'm thinking that the success of this wild, let it be kind of gardening probably has to do with the fact that some people nearby are doing such wonderful work planting their native plants. So these things connect with each other because we have an ecosystem that connects them. So these are mostly wild volunteers, and I'm watching what's emerging as I let them grow and don't mow and don't pick and don't, choose what's there. And you can see goldenrod, you can see a number of different plants that are in there. This is sort of another view of it. And some of the things that I've seen come up in this area include a variety of ferns, dandelions, lupins, valerian, black-eyed Susans, goldenrod, New England asters. You can see like I'm definitely borrowing from the seeds and birds from David's garden, right? So you can see some of them as they're emerging. And one of the things I really liked about this is that when you let nature do some of the work, it tends to form certain types of plant communities that like to be together. Some of them are accidental, but some of them come together because they enjoy being together. And in permaculture, we call those guilds. And a guild is a human recipe. So when somebody like David and the De Fiore sort of plan a garden, they do this really wonderful crafting and they think about what goes together, what blooms when, and they come up with this wonderful recipe for a beautiful garden. That's also like the permaculture garden that you first saw with all the beautiful flowers at New Forest, right? That was a sort of human recipe, but a really beautiful, well thought out, well designed one. So we call that a guild. When these collections of different plants come together in the wild, we call those companion plants. So one of the things that we do in permaculture is we go out to meadows, we go out to forests, we go out to natural places, and we see what kind of plants like to hang out with each other. And sometimes we explore what are the reasons why they like to hang out together. And sometimes it's structural, sometimes their roots don't compete, so they live very nicely next to each other, and sometimes they have different blooming seasons, and sometimes they have all kinds of ways of cooperating and helping each other. So some of the things we know and understand, and some of them we don't. So we often try to mimic the kinds of collections that we see in nature. So here's one place where if I'm letting things grow, I can start to learn about what kind of plants come together, which plants like to grow together, when they like to come in, etc. So I'm listening and watching and learning, and I'm getting a pretty nice, for 20-minute Iron Chef, not so bad, right? Letting nature do the work is a really great tool of mine. Like I love letting nature do a lot of the work. So that was one example. This second example came from actually a disturbance in the landscape. So disturbance really sets succession back, right? A disturbance means that whatever type of complexity you have in a particular area, some kind of damage has happened and there has to be some healing. So the damage that happened here, so you can just take a look at all the different kind of weeds. I don't even know what they all are, but these are growing in a situation that I'll show you in a moment. So in this particular permaculture principle, the idea is use small and slow solutions to deal with a disturbance in the landscape. And the disturbance actually happened right up in that corner. There was a 90-foot white pine 3 feet from my house that fell uphill away from the house.
Lucky you.
How did that happen? Anyway, it fell there and suddenly, and it hit the trees in my neighbor's place. And then it hit a couple of trees here that were conifers, and all these had to be taken down. So I suddenly lost like 4 different trees, most of them conifers, and I thought, that's a lot of biodiversity, that's a great disturbance, what am I going to do with this, right? So what I did is I had them lop off the tree, maybe this high from the ground, and I left the stump there. We'll talk about the stump in a moment. That's a thing you can do stuff with. You don't have to remove it or take it away, you can do stuff with a stump. And then you can see this is a large chip field. This whole thing is about this deep in chips. I had them chip all the branches, everything, and so I left all the biomass on the property. Because there was no soil, it's ledge. I don't even have a basement, I've got a slab because they couldn't even dig under. So I have no soil to garden on, and that's a trick of mine. I go where there's no soil and I make gardens. So I'll show you another example later on. But so I said, okay, I want an orchard. I want some fruit trees over here. They need some stuff to grow in. So I'm just going to put a bunch of chips and just slowly figure out how to help the chips decompose and make soil out of them. So that's what I was trying to do. And this is a few years into it, and what you see here are shrubs, yellow and white clover, some grapes, some grasses. It's a crazy wild explosion. And then I'm going to talk about one particular plant that was a terrible, nasty, noxious weed that I kept trying to remove from my property that was my best helper here. Isn't that interesting, right? Isn't that interesting how that happens? So these are the wood chips, and there's my friend. Anyone know what this is? This is horsetail. This is horsetail. It's a pioneer, it's a dinosaur plant. It looks like it's from the Permian age or something. I mean, it looks like a dinosaur plant, right? And it was growing all over in every other place, and I kept trying to pull it, and I learned that the best thing to do is to have other plants outcompete it, but I just wasn't succeeding. And then the chips came along, and then it loves chips. So it was one of the first early succession plants in the chips. And I saw that, and I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Because I had heard that the plants come to you that you need to have an interaction with. So at a different time, if you want to know how I cured pneumonia at home, the 3rd time I had it, it was because of plants that were growing around me that I pulled just before the fall, brought in my house, and they cured me because they were growing next to me. I've also used comfrey to, heal a rib injury. But the plants that you need sometimes grow around you if you're paying attention. This is another one of these observe and interact, right? There are partners, and they evolved with us. So they are typically all around us, interacting with us if we know it. So here's the problem, right? So natural erosion, it takes 200 to 1,000 years to form an inch of soil. It's a long time. I'm not going to be around then. My fruit trees, it's not going to happen, right? So I'm like, I better get a move on this. So I said slow solutions, but that's a little too slow, right? So what did I do is I did a couple things. These are a couple of the early plants that came in there, sourgrass, oxalis, and the horsetail, in order to help me build the soil. But there are some tricks. I didn't just let it be. That would be a little too slow. I did some interesting things too. I'm going to advance a slide. So here it is with all the horsetail growing all over it. But there are a couple of things that I did to this because I knew that this is a lot of carbon. And I knew from composting that carbon wants to have nitrogen in order to break down, right? It needs to have nitrogen. So I'm thinking, gosh, do I want to go out there and buy a lot of lawn fertilizing nitrogen? I don't even know where it comes from or what's in there. It's probably some process I don't understand. And then I remembered that urine, human urine, is NPK rich. It's liquid gold. It's your free, valuable, wonderful nitrogen fertilizer. So for 18 months, I peed into a bucket and brought it outside and poured it all over the chips. Somebody's going to arrest me, so don't take this out of this room, right? But I put a lot of nitrogen that was free, that came directly from me into the soil, because I thought, gosh, right, that's going to help out. And then I inoculated it with 2 different kinds of mushrooms, with chicken of the woods and oyster mushrooms. And if you want to learn more about this pea cycling, just go to Rich Earth Institute. It's a research center in Vermont that basically has taken this whole idea, and they give you home scale versions of it. And if you get this slideshow and you can click on it, you'll see a home scale version, but you can also, this one's the home scale version, but this institute will tell you all about the research they're doing about urine in, as a fertilizer. There are very specific ways that you use it that are safe, et cetera, but it works really well because guess what? We were meant not to cause pollution with our waste. It's not supposed to be waste, it's supposed to be food and fertilizer for something else in the ecosystem. So we were meant to return that back to the environment, not send it away at high cost, high energy, high pollution, somewhere else to be taken care of in the sewage system. That wasn't how nature intended it to be. And think about it, it's taken nature 3.8 billion years to come up with its recipes for what works. It has taken us 50 years or 100 to come up with sewage systems. I think nature wins, right? I think we might want to think about how natural design was meant to actually work in a really nice, sustainable and regenerative way. So I did that. So those are the 2 things that I did. These are some of the things that have been growing in there. And I'm just going to show you a couple more pictures. I think that's one of them. I don't know what this particular mushroom is. I don't know if it's one of them that I inoculated, but I have a couple of other ones. So this came up. I was really happy to see thistle, right? Because that's a kind of a dynamic accumulator that will really throw on some nice deep roots. And it's a weed. You don't want it in your garden, but it's going to do some fabulous work building soil for me. So that I don't have to do the work. And then here are the chicken of the woods mushrooms decomposing on some of the logs that I cut and left there. And here are some, maybe dark field cap mushrooms. I don't know. I'm not a mushroom, kind of person. So I'm guessing here. I didn't eat them, notice. And in fact, they can be confused with something that's kind of poisonous, something called veiled poison pie. So I did not eat these mushrooms. But the red leaf is there so that you can tell the scale. The scale is the same on, oh, I guess I had a red leaf somewhere else too. Yeah, there. So these are probably common bonnet mushrooms as well. They also came up. And so what I'm doing, and you can see some of the little weeds that are coming up all around, what I'm doing there is I'm actually starting succession and I'm jump starting it. So it's not like I'm doing nothing, but I'm also not doing all of the work and I'm not doing all of the inputs. I'm sort of working with nature so that nature is working and I'm working, and together this process is going to be building soil. So maybe in 5 or 10 years, I'm going to have this much soil, right? So think about an inch per 1,000 years. That's like 8,000 years of work in 5 years. That's pretty good working with nature, right? Like I'm thinking I'm scored, So this is one of the things that I do because I'm so busy and I don't have a time and sort of resources to sometimes put all the effort into it. So I work a lot with nature and I let nature do some of the work for me. One of my favorite stories like this is I'm doing a project about sort of different entanglements of humans in a forest in New Hampshire, and we talk about what happened after glaciers, and something was really important happening then that should probably happen now, which is called assisted migration. Because our climates are changing, and what's native now to an area might not be native in 10 years. It might be moving north, it might be moving west, right? Things are going to be moving. And so humans may need to help assist with those migrations. And they certainly did that when the glaciers receded and melted. Humans wanted nut trees to come with them. They wanted them to, follow them as they moved north, as the glaciers started to melt. So that was an example of early assisted migration. And we may want to be sort of rewilding in the way that we're also doing assisted migration and thinking about what would I want to move. So my favorite story about that is, I tell my students, so indigenous people wanted beeches and they wanted acorns and they wanted chestnuts. And so they would get whole piles of them and take them and carry them with them when they moved. And they would bring them to their new sites. They would move them north. So how did they plant all of them? How did they get planted? Any ideas?
Squirrels.
Exactly, squirrels. They left the piles right outside their camp, and then within a couple of weeks, the animals had taken them and buried them all over the place. So that's another example of letting nature do the work, right? If you watch those flows through your yard or through your ecosystem and you see what's doing what, you can kind of like, hook your cart onto that natural wagon and let the nature do the work. So that was one of my favorite tricks, is like find out what nature's doing and sort of work with nature. Then I don't have to work quite as hard. Okay, so the third permaculture principle is apply self-regulation and accept feedback. That's one of the things that we're not doing right now, which is why we have overshoot and climate change, right? Because we're not really engaged with what is giving us feedback. We don't even hear the feedback. So here's another experiment. So this particular experiment is growing on a driveway. So this is another example of soil building. I had hard pan gravel driveway, and I'm like, I don't want this much driveway. This is going to have to become a garden. So I did I scraped at it. It was too hard to till. I scraped at it. I took a fork. I threw some leaves from the forest, and I put some compost on it. I got some ducks. I got some chickens. I just threw everything organic that I could, to this land. And I finally ended up building soil, but most of it came locally, or it came from animals that I had, or it came from compost, or we even did humanure compost toilet with my children, and so some of that was part of this as well. That's a whole other process which we can also talk about. That again, you can use human waste if you do it properly and you compost it properly and to the right temperature, and you can use it to build soil as well. It's meant to do that. So I created soil in this area, and I put wood chips all around my paths, and these are keyhole beds. And so one of the things that I was doing here is I was creating a polyculture. This is an example of a kind of guild. This is a recipe one. This is a guild, not a companion, because I'm choosing the plants. So there are about maybe 11 to 13 different types of plants here. See if you can figure out what they are. You can name any of them. Lettuces, nasturtiums, kale, lacinato kale. Yeah, so there's a bunch of different stuff all in here. You don't see, I didn't put beans in here, but these are all some of the kinds of things that are in here. And this is sort of a pick and as you pass. This is near the doorway. So, we picked from this garden all year long and had greens at just about every meal. And then it just kept growing. And the really nice thing about this particular garden is that it's a little bit wild. Once again, it's not your rows of very controlled kind of things. It's just a spreading of seeds, and you thin it out by eating it, and then it keeps growing. So it's a really fun garden to try. You don't see the beans there, but there were green beans as well, and there was broccoli. And as I pulled some things, I would put other seeds in. So it's kind of like and here's a little bit of a closer view. You can see that it's quite beautiful, right? It's just lovely. It's not like your rows of it's just very full and very rich and very yummy.
How close did you plant?
Too close. I planted them a little bit close, so I would recommend having them sparsely planted. So maybe a seed every inch or so, like in a kind of checkerboard grid pattern. And then as things grow, you can pull them out and eat them and make more room. So I planted them a little bit densely. They probably would have thrived more, but I was a little nervous and I didn't know if it was going to work. And so I just overdid it, but we kept pulling and eating all year long. So, and then the next image that I have is to show you how long this kind of a garden lasts. This is a set of keyhole beds, and you can see it's fall. And the kale is still coming up, and some of the other greens are still there, and the buckwheat's in flower, so it's a late blooming, pollinator plant. It's still going on. The rabbit hutch is right out back there, and the rabbits were really instrumental in both fertilizing this and also eating some of it and playing with my kids and all of that stuff. So it just goes on through the seasons. And then this is wintertime, and the kale and the broccolis are still out there. Like, we couldn't eat it fast enough. We kept having to go in there, and the deer were really happy. And I've learned that I have competitors, right? Because deer know that after the first frost, this stuff tastes amazing. It gets sweeter, it's lovely, and so it's always a toss-up who gets to the kale first, the deer or me, right? Because I've always been around deer, and I don't mind the deer eating some of my garden. I plant enough so that they can eat some and I can eat some. Like, if there's food, there's enough for everybody. right? So, and there's so little wild natural places left so that our wildlife can eat, that they should be able to eat from my garden. I don't keep the deer out. I just, I let some of the animals eat some of my food. So, you can see the rabbits in the back with my daughter. They were some of our helpers. So again, having your children take care of the rabbits and having the rabbits poop on the garden, that's perfect for me. Everyone gets taken care of. I don't do a lot of the work. So I love those types of gardening exercises. Here's another experiment. So further down, you can see, way in the back is that part of the driveway. This is the front of the driveway. I took up the whole driveway. There was no place for cars. No more cars in my driveway. Nobody can park when they come and visit here, where I used to be. So these are tomato stakes. Those are not tomatoes. Does anybody know what this is? So this started to grow around my tomatoes. It's a weed. You probably don't like this weed. In fact, it's very prickly. These are nettles. These are stinging nettles. And they started to grow around my tomatoes, and I'm like, oh man. But here I am, lazy gardener, don't have time, look it up. It's a companion. It's a companion for tomato plants. Isn't that great? I don't have to pull it, I don't have to weed, they're just gonna be helpers, thank goodness, right? So I started to let it grow. This is the second season because so I thought to myself, so I looked up the nutrient values, right? Okay, so there's a lot of things going on here, and I'm thinking, oh, why is the nettle coming? Why is it coming to help my tomatoes? Well, it turns out they start off as volunteers, then they became companion plants, then they became the main harvest. Because why? Because they volunteer, I don't have to plant them. Less work. Number 2, they're perennial. I don't have to plant them every year. They just keep coming back. Number 3, they're more nutritious than tomatoes. Number 4, they're native. I don't live in the Mediterranean. I love tomatoes, but I don't live in the Mediterranean. I live here, and this is my native plant, and I can eat it. And I can make tea, and I can put it in soups, and it's just a wonderfully nutritious plant. So this is what happens when you're a lazy gardener who doesn't do their work properly and just watches what nature gives you. And then if you pay attention, sometimes it brings you gifts. And that's the main lesson that I've learned from rewilding, is that if I just back up a little bit and I'm not so much in control, I do some. I want to be engaged, but I also want to watch what nature brings me and to see how I can work with the energies that are on the property. And so that's what I've tried to do in my various experiments. This is a picture of North Bridgeton, Maine, that I just thought, this was one of the 2 photographs on this that is not, from one of our gardens, so you get that one for free. But it just looked like a whole community of garden spaces. It looked a lot like the image that David showed us, where there were sort of plots around Camden where people were gardening, and I thought it was a nice way of thinking about community rewilding. So I wanted to leave this open for the group for questions and also for discussion. I'm just going to leave this up there. These are some ways that not only can we do things individually, but maybe we can sort of start to connect the things that we're doing with each other, so that we have little corridors or little connecting backyards, or we have waterways that flow through different properties, or so that we're doing this not in isolation, but we're building a whole community kind of food rewilding web. And I want to end with something that I had my last class today. This is a digital design class, and students were looking at alternative ways of thinking about the world so they can do their digital design in new spaces. And so I asked them to pick something that they would be most interested in doing. And one of my students had a fabulous idea. They got this from the Imagination Manifesto that Rob Hopkins from the Transition Town Movement put out. Fabulous long document of like thousands of wonderful good ideas that we could be working on. So one of my students said, what about if the subsidies for growing food weren't given to the corporations, but were given to all the people growing food in their own backyards? And I thought, wouldn't that be lovely? Decentralize, food growing, decentralize, so that we now have agency about the food we grow and the relationship we have with the world. And then instead of funding and subsidizing the 1% big companies and corporations who are producing crappy food for us anyway, we actually are helping each other in our neighborhoods distribute the resources that we need to grow food for each other. And this actually happened, as you know, in the Victory Gardens during World War II, when food was scarce and everybody was growing food. It happened in the USSR when we had the fall of the Soviet Union. The people were surviving because the grandmothers had their gardens and their dashas, and they were going out with public transportation and train rides to the country and growing food and bringing it back into the town. So these local gardens really saved us in World War II. They really saved Soviet Union when it had a fall, and also when Cuba had the embargo, and they're still under embargo from us, when they basically also started growing their own food, dispersed all the way around locally in small gardens, not big corporations growing our food, and they also have one of the highest standards of living with very low sort of energy footprint on the, in the world. So there's some really interesting examples to learn from that. So I'm just going to leave this up there and see if there are any questions, and invite David to come back up and see if you have questions for either one of us. But thank you for.
Yes.
Well, I actually have a comment rather than a question. I'm very lucky to be part of that community group of people that are doing what you're saying. And I just wanted to say that one little space between the back of my house and the house next to me was open, and they started tearing down some trees. They trim trees every year, and they just pile all this stuff there. And they usually burn it up or something at the end, and I said, why don't you leave it there as a burn? And they have, and the birds are just so incredibly happy there. It's just amazing to see that, just a pile of decaying trees, limbs, and this little pile of, it's just amazing. And how it's just created such an amazing intersection.
Nice, yeah.
Yeah, leave little messes around your gardens. Don't have everything be manicured. Leave a little pile of stones, leave a little pile of branches, leave, a dead tree in the back, or those kinds of things are really important habitat. You don't have to have everything cleaned up, and we can do that in our yards, and they'll be much wilder.
If there aren't any questions, I have a comment. I think you're sort of looking at two very distinct approaches tonight in terms of making meadows happen. But one of the really strong common threads here is the diversity involved. And diversity is really resilience. So if you look at these two approaches, and one looks really planned and really organized and so forth, it's not really. By the time the meadow's 3 years old, you're sort of where she is, right?
Same place.
But the diversity that occurs, as long as you don't keep taking it out, and you're observant and you're working on creating a diverse environment, you can get them with both. The premise that I started out with is a little different, though. It's that a lot of the folks that I talk to and come and visit my place, they want to do something with their yard. They've got lawn, right? And what I showed you was 800 square feet. It could have been 80 square feet or 50 square feet. It could have been a small area in which there were simply 8 or 10 plants planted. And that could have been the beginning of their journey to start to remove more and more of the lawn, which is a monoculture. It's really a desert. Lawns are doing absolutely nothing for the environment. And so I do have in my backyard where the chickens are now, I do have an area that I let grow completely. I don't do anything to it. It grows up as a meadow as well. But another thing I wanted to point out is if you're going to do this sort of a prep and plan, there are other ways to do the prep. And I wanted to just let people know. Some people, particularly if they have a very large area that they want to create a meadow in, will use pesticides. And that's not great, but it's very quick, it's very efficient, and if you've got a large area.
What?
Pesticides.
Oh, I mean
Herbicides, chemicals to kill. The other thing is burning. You can also do that, and that's very effective for a smaller area. You've got to get rid of that organic material if you're going to try to develop the native perennials. The weeds are going to come up. I mean, they're going to be there in a couple of years, but starting off is it's important. And the other thing I wanted to say was that as either one of these types of meadows matures, that they need some maintenance, they need some management, whether it's you're eating it, right, on a daily basis, which is a sort of management. It's a wonderful experience to be able to do that. Or they need, like Amy and I did this past September, we went into that meadow where there were some spots that were barren, that had really no growth, and we decided to put some additional species of native perennials in the area. So there is some management that goes along with it.
David, I was going to ask, because don't you find that there are certain, or I don't know, do you find that there is a balance that's created, or do you find that there are some plants that are so invasive and dominant that you do have to manage that?
In my experience, yes. I mean, for example, this year, the goldenrod really just started to dominate everything. So I probably removed out of, I don't know, 40 plants, 20 of them. I just dug them up and removed them. I had some Digitalis penstemon that I'm in the garden club here, and we had an exercise where people came in and we dug up the plant and subdivided it. We did that with the Baptisia as well, because those plants were crowding others.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's part of the management that's
Exactly.
going to happen.
Yeah, and if you can do it in a way that takes that plant and gives it away to somebody who would like to plant it someplace else, that's what I like to do.
I was gonna say on that, I have our front yard by the sidewalk. I don't know, maybe it's 8 by 10. I don't know, bigger than that. Anyway, a lot of the plants in it. There's a woman who has a big garden up the road, and she'll just put stuff out in little pots, and maybe she'll charge $1. Sometimes she gives them away. But I just walked by. I mean, I don't know that these qualify as native plants. I think they're native. They're like what the woman has, right?
They're from my neighborhood.
That's right. This is my, and other, and stuff from the neighbor on the other side blows over, and so you end up with.
Yeah,
quite an amazing.
and another factor you have to take into consideration if you buy a piece of property where I bought a piece of property is what do the neighbors think? Because everybody there has lawn. I mean, and now I think partly as a result of what I've done, there's a lot less lawn. There are more native plants, but I think I was maybe overly cautious in terms of being new to Maine, new to the community. I didn't want to create a situation that looked terribly messy. Now there's a way to deal with that, which is all about the edges. Amy and I have talked about this, because if the edges look good, people don't really care too much about what's going on inside. I will say that people have been very interested in what I've been doing. There's a lot of people who walk their dogs back there. There's quite a bit of human traffic, foot traffic, and there have been no complaints in 5 years. People are actually pretty enthusiastic. What are you doing? How's your pawpaw trees doing this year? So I've been very, very pleased with the acceptance level. But I have made a conscious effort to be a little, and I'll ask them. I'll say, what do you think? Because one of my neighbors has the finest lawn in Christendom, and he is quite objective about it. He says, I'm absolutely obsessed with this, making it look that way. And we get along great, and he likes what I do and appreciates it, so.
We have a question on Zoom. What would you recommend for rewilding a garden that has many invasive species?
It depends what those species are. Some invasive species are really destructive. Humans on this continent from Europe are invasive species. right? We don't quite belong here. And because of climate change, things that are, so it really depends on how invasive and what those things are. So, the example that I had with horsetail, that was invasive on my property, and then it came in and did some really interesting pioneer work when I was breaking down chips. So a lot of early plants that are, even invasive ones, they're often early pioneers and they're often healers. They're often coming because of the disturbance in the land. And they're coming in there to heal. If they're no longer doing their healing work, then maybe they don't belong there and you can remove them. But David had a great suggestion by putting down a tarp. And if you put down the tarp long enough and there's enough heat and there isn't any water, then that will die and it will die off. And you can remove the organic matter, or you can compost that, bring it to a high enough temperature and then reuse it. So I'm not very fond of removing organic matter. I like to reuse it. But sometimes you have to remove those seeds, and he gave one method for, doing that.
It's a complicated issue because I would say the first thing is, what are those plants? Identify the plants and what they are. I'll tell you a little bit of a story that I observed this last summer, is that evening primrose, everybody probably has some or knows what it is. And it has a fairly beautiful flower, but it's largely considered a weed, and a lot of people go around taking it out. Well, one of the things I observed about the middle of July was that as I was removing one of the plants from a place where I didn't think it belonged, it was covered in Japanese beetles. Yeah. And so I could kill like 50 Japanese beetles with one clap of the hands. And then I said, well, wait a minute, maybe this is happening around the property. So I didn't take out any more. And I observed that almost every one of those plants was a target for those Japanese beetles. And I said, well, I don't care if this is invasive or not. It did appear that it was decreasing the amount of Japanese beetle infiltration on my raspberries, for example. So you got to know what you're dealing with first. And then there's a lot of expertise about that too. You can get on a lot of information online about how to deal with invasives.
I was reading an article the other day, or a couple of them, that people who have like really awful invasive things like bishop's weed that is all over Camden, and it showed up at my house. I don't know where it came from, of course. And I'm like, well, what shall I do about this? I'm not really one who would dig up the whole lawn or whatever, the whole area, to get out these deep, deep roots. And they were talking about, well, maybe there's some native, like, so-called invasive, or overwhelming things like goldenrod or something that really takes over, that could take over the bishop's weed. I was actually thinking about anemones, like native anemones.
There might be something that could compete with it.
That would compete
within
enough to
your
get
space,
over it, yeah. And Gretchen has some of that at her house. She has like anemones growing with the bishop's weed and seeing what happens next. I think it's really interesting to try out some experiments like that and not consider things that just, like the evening primrose, maybe it's not so bad that it's around, or maybe we can leave,
I'm great with it
plant.
now. Yeah.
It helps if your invasive thing is edible.
Yeah.
That's good too.
Because you need a good predator, and if you're the predator, that dandelions, if you're a good predator, you can eat up a lot of those things, right? So it really depends on what kind of relationship you want to have with the property and what the properties of the plant are and what you're trying to do. Can it do a service for you, or is it doing some harm? Can you eat it? Can other animals, can other wildlife eat it? When I was building soil in the driveway, one of the major problems I had is classic permaculture. I brought all kinds of leaves in from the forest and I tried to grow stuff, and I got slugs up ice slugs like all over the place. And it's a very funny saying in permaculture that, you don't have an abundance of slugs, you have a deficiency of ducks. So that meant that I had to have ducks because ducks are predators for slugs. And so suddenly my kids had a new pet. Like, this was great for the family. It was a little bit more work, but my kids were happy as clams to have ducks around, and the ducks just ate up all my slugs. They pooped on my garden, and then I was at the next level. So sometimes dealing with an invasive is just figuring out not just one plant, but what are all the relationships among the predators and the pests and what eats what and what outcompetes what and what service is it doing, and do you need that service there? There's a lot of factors to think about But really great information online about each of these plants in cooperative extension. Maine Cooperative Extension has a lot of really great information.
You know, another example is that I have a lot of comfrey, and everybody knows that that's a great plant if you're trying to, you know, add it to your compost, or if you're gonna make teas and, you know, well,
Fix ribs.
thistles basically do the same thing biologically, right? So here I am, you know, now I don't, depending on where the thistle is growing, I let it grow, and then I cut it down and add it to the compost now, which is, I think, a better way to deal with it. It's gonna come back, but, you know, then I'll just cut it down again. Same thing with the comfrey.
I just want, everything you say, I have something I wanna add. But, every year since I lived here, there have been different, I suppose natives, but most of them considered weeds, have exploded. And it's a different variety each year, and then it might come back. I remember there was a kind of buttercup that just was,
Yeah.
and then another year was dandelions, another year was valerian.
Valerian,
Another year was, what do you call them, those little blue flowers?
Forget-me-nots?
Yeah, forget-me-nots, and sometimes they'll do another round. So that's the thing, and lupins that take over are considered invasive. They only last about 8 years and then they're done, they don't wanna be there anymore, so there's a lot of change.
Yeah, last year I had, on one of the edges of my property facing north, I have a row of arborvitae, and there's a berm that goes down to the street. And for some reason or other, on that berm and the grass that was growing there, the dandelions proliferated. I mean, it was a solid yellow, right? And it hadn't done that before, and I just left it there, you know, because it was so pretty. And people would come by and they say, I'm so glad you left those. There's somebody across the street, he's out there with it, you know, big enough anyway. I don't know. You know, I think one of the things that I'd like to say is there really aren't any rules, you know. You don't have to do just a particular kind of method. You don't have to just do natives. You can do what you want if it's your property and experiment.
So, you live out sort of countryside, you're in a sort of old farm area, you've got space and everything. The most inspiring story that got me focused on permaculture and just working with what you have is a book called Paradise Lot.
Eric Townsmeyer.
And where these two guys, they wanted to do a permaculture project, but they wanted to find the worst possible soil in a very tight town where the lots were very small, and they found this. It was in Holyoke, in Massachusetts, and they found this. It was a new house in an old residential area, and it had had a lot of construction equipment going through. The ground was completely compacted and just a total mess. But the house had the space that they needed, and then they had this little, I don't know, 2/10 of an acre, something like that, at the back, and they did what you said. They watched for a year, and then they started to work, and they've got the book called Paradise Lot, which is a wonderful book. But there was a show on Living on Earth that they did, I don't know, 10 years ago, something like that, which was, Living on Earth covers a lot of good stuff, but it's often more depressing than it is uplifting. And this was the most uplifting episode. And it just shows you what you can do, that what happened on their property was like a miracle. It took years, but they documented the whole thing. It is really, if one wants to do this and you've got a hard case of a yard sitting out there, they show you what's possible.
Yeah, it's a beautiful paradise-looking place. It's basically a kind of forest garden with a little bit of annuals and some beds. But yeah, it's a really prolific, many storied. Those stories that we talked about, they had food in all of those different stories. Eric just did a workshop for the Permaculture Association of Northeast that I was at, and his topic this time was permaculture for climate change. And he talked about how you plan and how you design a garden or, you know, a lot or whatever you're trying to design when you have change all around you and when you have resilience issues and when you have temperature variations and when the sort of zones that you're gardening in might be changing and when the temperature has extremes. Do you have a plant that needs to survive in very dry conditions and then you have a downpour? Like what plants survive that kind of thing? So that's one of the things he's doing now is he's looking at how do we do this stuff in changing times.
One of the things that ties into that, that Amy and I have talked about, and you've really done a lot of work in Texas on this, is the concept of corridors. So you can imagine 25 years from now where Camden has 6 or 8 times the number of gardens of the kinds that we're talking about now, highly diverse and so forth. And there are specific corridors that we think of and that actually work in terms of spreading the plants, sharing the bees or the pollinators, thinking through how a garden like that, which may be susceptible to an insect, because there's not a lot of diversity in that space, is linked up with a garden area nearby that provides more of that diversity. I think that's sort of one of my visions, and because we need to think about this as not just my piece of property, but my piece of property and my neighbor's property and the property, that is, a few blocks away, and how do they interact?
I always add, for things that are both invasive and native, Jan, whose gardens was mentioned by Sarah because she's the person who puts things out on the street. She introduced me to fiddleheads in the garden, in the raspberries, with leaves piled on them, and she has to give the fiddleheads away partly every year because they reproduce. They really want to get into your garden, but they give you fiddleheads in the spring.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And then another one is Jerusalem artichokes, which some people can't. I mean, that's very invasive. But, and some people can eat them and they're great and other people can't, but, yeah.
One of the things I think that I became aware of when doing this is that I will probably always want to have an annual veggie patch somewhere, whether it's mixed up or whether it's a row of tomatoes, because I like some of those European veggies. I eat a lot of them, and so I want to have that. But in that garden, I know that I am working against nature. Everything here wants to be a forest. Everything here wants to be a forest, and so it's all about succession. You start with like disturbed earth, the weeds come in, they set the territory for a little bit of fertility, and then the brambles come in, and then the sort of birch come in, and then those grow up and then they die, and then the conifers and the hardwoods come in. In fact, the woman who wrote The Mother Tree, Susan Simard, I think, she's talking about people who are trying to restart forests too quickly, these sort of tree plantations, by skipping those early steps of succession. They're skipping over those those weed steps or those birch and brambles step, and what's happening is they're planting in soil that's not ready for the trees, and so the trees are sick and they're diseased. They need to have those steps of succession. So you can maybe assist succession and help it to go faster. If you pee on your chips, that's great, but you probably need to have that succession take its time. And you want to think about when you're growing stuff, are you in this particular patch working with succession, helping it grow into a climax community with high, carbon sequestration and high, biomass? Or are you going to be doing every year you're bringing it back to succession, doing an annual garden? And in most of our backyards, we're probably doing both. Like trees are part of the succession forest thing, and annuals are part of the, working against the flow thing. So we're probably going to be doing a little bit of both, but knowing which is which and knowing where you're working with the natural progression and when you're working against it can help you answer some of the questions about what plants belong here. Is this invasive or not? What do I want to have here next year? Do I have to manage this meadow? Does the meadow want to become a forest, or can I keep it a meadow? If I can eat, many of the things, or I can give away the flowers in the meadow, that's going to be management, and that's going to keep it going the way it is because it has a function at that stage. So you have to make a decision about where you're working, I think, and be conscious of that.
I'll just be real
Charlie.
quick. I don't know if this qualifies as rewilding, but this is our second year in Maine, and we decided to do no mow May.
Yeah.
That became no mow June, no mow July, and then we had little paths through this beautiful meadow and didn't know what we had, and it was really a lot of fun to do.
You're in the observe and interact stage doing major observations, and that's pretty cool. You can learn.
Instantly this tall, and then you have paths going through, it reminded my wife of her grandma's farm.
So one of the things that's probably happening there that happened in the sort of keyhole beds where I was is that when I first got there, there was very little life of any kind, even insects, because it was a driveway. And over a period of 5 years I no longer live at that property, but when I was there, all kinds of life came in. I'm just going to name some of them, right? The insects came. I planted corn seeds. They never grew. I kept having to replant them. I didn't know what was happening. And suddenly there was corn growing in places I had never put it. The squirrels came in and the chipmunks, and they replanted my corn. They took them out of the corn hills where they were all set out, and they put them somewhere else. So those little critters came in. And then we had rabbits fertilizing. We had snakes. We had frogs. We had a skunk that came in to attack our ducks. I had to go attack the skunk. That was a whole story. We had foxes come in to eat our rabbits. One of them took the rabbit away. We watched it, walk down our driveway. So we had a whole proliferation of wildlife, from insects all the way up to the predators, in this space where we planted a garden. So that was just, that kind of rewilding was really remarkable to me. And my children were able to watch that whole succession. So there's succession with trees and meadows and plants and stuff, but there's succession with wildlife coming back into an area, because it's a banquet. I mean, you're making a nice little banquet, and you probably want to share some of it. Don't kill everything, don't shoot it, don't put pesticides in it, like share your food.
Joline, did you want to share those other websites?
Yeah, so Eric Tonesmeyer gave me a resource at that recent workshop that I was at online that some of you may be interested in. I don't know if we can see it online, but it's linked in the slideshow. I think the slideshow will be available for folks, right?
Yes.
So one of the slideshows is this one, Best Plants to Attract Diverse Beneficial Insects. This is Tonesmeyer's little article. And what I really love about this is that he lists top species, there's about 10 here, and when they flower, so you can do the thing that David was trying to do, have flowering all the way down. But for each species, he shows what kinds of benefit it has. So crop pollinating bees, other wasps, pollinating flies, beetles, butterflies, larvae for butterflies, and hummingbirds. So, and there's it's a really nice list because it's got this, for every, oops, couldn't preview file. Well, maybe I have to reload it. Hold on. Can I reload that? Let me reload the page.
10 minutes till the library closes.
Okay. So this is just available, and okay, so yeah, so if I go, this is false indigo, so you can see those, but if you, this is, the milkweeds, and you can see that's very high in 4 categories and high in many of other one. This is a new one. You can drink the tea, New Jersey tea, and it's also quite high across the board. Beautiful white flower, and this we saw already. It's in David's garden, bee balm, the Mornata families, very good for hummingbirds, very good for wasps. Native cherries and plums are super high. Those are really good for all kinds of plants. These are all natives, right? Mountain mints, also really good. Not good for hummingbirds, but very high in some of the other categories. Willows. So this will be available. Goldenrods, you can go take a look at this. This is a really nice resource that David put together. And I wanted to show you one other thing, which is I would love to have Camden get involved in this. certify your habitat to help wildlife and build corridors to do this. You can actually certify your property as a wildlife habitat. And like, wouldn't it be cool if we had corridors all the way through our communities and gardens of these kinds of things, and we just put ourselves on the map, growing food for ourselves and for wildlife? I think that would be way cool. So that was one of the.